And
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. A Foreign Office minister has told the Commons it's right to describe Alexei Navalny's death as murder. The Russian opposition figure died at a prison in the Arctic Circle on Friday, with the Kremlin claiming he fell ill after a walk. We now know 3 children who were found dead at a house in the Seamills area of Bristol yesterday were aged 7, 3 and 9 months. A 42-year-old woman's being held on suspicion of murder. The Business Secretary's accused the former Post Office chairman of trying to seek revenge after he was dismissed. Henry Staunton claims a civil servant told him to stall the compensation payments to some postmasters impacted by the Horizon scandal. But Kemi Badenoch says there's no evidence that happened. Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds has called for transparency.
We do now have 2 completely contrasting accounts, one from the former chair of the Post Office and one from the Secretary of State, and only one of these accounts can be the truth. And I hope we're all in agreement that Parliament is the correct place for these matters to be raised and clarified, because what we need now is transparency and scrutiny.
In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 17 points at 77.29. The pound buys $1.26 and a euro 17.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy. Climate action you can be proud of.
Dry and cloudy in the south, but rain in the north. Increasingly windy overnight with a low of 6 Celsius. Rain spreading southeastwards tomorrow. Wintry showers in Scotland with a high of 13. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC. From Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question. With Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to the panel, 0345 6060 973. Got a couple of spaces on the board. If you phone now, you will get through. Joining me on the panel tonight, to my right, Angela Epstein, journalist and broadcaster. To her right, Natasha Devon, my LBC presenter colleague. To my left, Caroline Flint, former Labour MP, who was a minister in the Blair and Brown governments, and Sir Robert Goodwill, who's been a minister in all the different Tory Prime Ministers' governments, I think, over the last 10 years. Not Boris. Not
half an hour of Boris.
Half an hour. Well, he is Conservative MP for Scarborough and Whitby and chairs the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. The number to call again, 0345 6060 973, text 84850, or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And, of course, do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's kick off with Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Ian and panel. Yeah, and the question
it's a special treat for Caroline that she's got one of her former constituents asking the first question.
Yeah, I met Caroline. She's lovely. She's absolutely lovely.
Thank you, Martin.
Richie Sunak says he has a plan and it's working after the 2 by-election results. What is that plan and is it really working?
Well, I have to go to you first, Robert Goodwill, I'm afraid.
Well, obviously the plan is to get the economy back into fettle, as we say in Yorkshire, so we can reduce taxes. And, the main target was to get inflation down. Inflation's now at 4%, and much to a lot of people's surprise, it stayed at 4%. And I think in due course, interest rates will come down, which will mean that the government will have to spend less on servicing its debt, and people's mortgages will hopefully get cheaper. So, the economy is coming round, and although we're in a technical recession, that's nothing like the sort of recessions we saw at the end of the Brown government when the banks were in crisis, or indeed, when the whole country went into lockdown. So, the forecasts seem to be that the economy is going to get better. It's turning round, and I'm confident that people will feel a little bit better by the summer.
But how can you say it's turning round? Well, we are now in recession, which we weren't before, and we're not going to be able to come out of recession until the middle of the year.
Well, it's not a very deep recession. In fact, a lot of the pundits and the economists that were analysing the situation was basically saying, well, don't panic, guys. This isn't like recession we've had before. This isn't going to go on for years and years. And, you look at the unemployment levels, we've still got very high levels of employment. Unemployment's still below 4%. In my constituency, we're still seeing investment coming in, a lot of jobs being created. So, I think it's a case of sort of don't panic, Mr. Mannering. Yes, we're in a technical recession, but we're not in a sort of financial crisis that would mean Chancellor of the Exchequer having to make brash decisions and make things probably worse in the short term.
The budget is going to be key, isn't it? Because Jeremy Hunt has got to get that right, and that really is the last chance saloon for the Conservative Party, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think it is. I mean, obviously, I get the state pension now, and that's going up by 6.5%, which is honouring our triple lock. So the pensioners hopefully will feel a bit better. But I'd like to see some tax cuts, particularly for the lowest paid. I mean, when we came to power in 2010, you started paying tax at 6,500. It's now well over 12,500. So I think if we're going to make those who are struggling most feel a little bit wealthy, we need to take more people out of tax. And on top of the reduction in national insurance, I think that should help people cope with some of the pressures that I know a lot of people are facing. Even Rachel Reeves says she dreads the bills coming in at the end of the month.
Don't we all? Caroline?
Well, yeah, and the fact is that whilst energy prices have reduced, they're still way up beyond where they were in 2019. And for a lot of people, not just those who are at the low income and people that I work with in my work around fuel poverty, but even above that, affordability for energy bills is still a big worry. But it's also the general cost of living as well that people are finding. And, Martin said, about Rishi Sunak had a plan. Yes, he had a plan to reduce inflation, but he also had a plan around growth. And we've not really seen any sign of that. And all the gossip and the briefings around the next budget around tax cuts, you've got to pay for tax cuts somewhere. You've got to pay for them somewhere. And the public are not stupid. They are also thinking about, well, hang on, we need to make sure that we support some of our public services because they were cut dramatically from 2010 to 2015. And we've had a game of catch-up ever since. Increased police numbers, increase the money to schools, put some more money back into this. It's all catching up from some of those decisions that were made from 2010 to 2015. Nobody wants to pay more tax than they feel they have to, but they also want to make sure they've got those public services that they cannot buy private to pay their way out of to make sure they can support their families. And the clock is ticking, Robert. There is very little time to turn this round, and that was shown, I think, in the by-elections last week.
Labour, though, don't seem to have a credible alternative. If you want to get public services back on track, that will cost extra money, and there's nothing really in the Labour programme to suggest that they're going to provide that.
I would agree with you that actually some of the plans around what money is actually going to be spent, Labour's going to have to be probably clearer about that. But what they have said, which is important for the Labour Party, I know only so well, is to show that they understand that throwing money at things is not the answer either. And that was one of the things that led to us losing in 2019 and actually in 2017 as well under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. So they have committed to keep within the spending plans. It's a bit deja vu from 97 when I first came in. But also, they do have some plans about how they would like to grow the economy, not in 1 year, but in a steady course over 5 years, 10 years. And I think people are listening to Labour and giving them a hearing. But there's no doubt about it, Ian. Whoever wins the next general election, there is not a lot of cash floating around. What we need to see is value for money. And when we spend money on policies, we make them work and we deliver. I think people want to hear more about delivery than just another big ticket item, which is why I think actually Rachel Reeves' decision, the Labour Party's decision to move away from a 28 billion a year spending headline was a good thing, because to be honest, in that space on energy and on getting to net zero, we need more focus on the delivery of the money that's already going into this area.
Natasha Devon.
I mean, it always fascinates me that people hark back to 2010 and that note that was famously left by the...
You're going to do it anyway.
Well, no, because when you look at the amount of debt we are currently in, it is dwarfing the amount of debt that we're in 2010. And so we're going to need a bigger note. And so the idea that Rishi Sunak, who I was listening to Carol Vorderman on a podcast, our other LBC podcast, and she was saying how the amount of money that was squandered on PPE contracts in that Tory Lane fast track that didn't even work would be enough to give every single junior doctor a 35% pay rise over a decade. And Rishi Sunak was Chancellor of the Exchequer when that happened. So the idea that he is telling us to trust him and telling us to trust him when the plan seems to be to lower taxes, when look at the state of everything. Look at the NHS, look at education. everything is crumbling and it needs investment. How can you possibly say trust us, given the scenario that we face ourselves in? I think it's ludicrous to say we're going to do more of the same because it's clearly working. I feel gaslit.
But do you, even though you probably don't agree with it, do you see that he does have a plan?
No, because inflation has nothing to do with him, is it? Inflation ebbs and flows.
Well, it wasn't
anyway.
when it went up, but it is now. It's coming down.
What he promised us was growth, which I've yet to see.
Angela.
Well, look, I think a lot of what I was going to say was already covered, so bye. See ya. But so I won't sort of bore the listener by repeating it all, but I would say something sort of spooling back to the actual specific question, which is the appearance of a plan. I think one of the problems is aside from all the external factors that have created issues for us, which are beyond any party's control, be it the war in Ukraine, be it a global recession, be it all the COVID, the coattails of COVID, etc. I think part of the issue with the Conservative government at the moment is there is a lack of, the optics are all wrong, because there seems to be so much infighting and so much squabbling and so much lack of a cohesion. I mean, only today the papers were full of stories about the prospective leadership contest. You know, it's sort of letting the mistress in before the wife's got divorced. It's not a good. That was an absolutely torturous analogy. I'm really sorry, but
Quite a charming analogy.
But for these prices, this is as good as it gets.
The husband.
Yes, indeed. How terribly egalitarian of you, Iain. But the point is, I think part of the problem for the ordinary layperson who is perhaps not, no pun intended, invested in how interest rates play off against inflation, don't understand the whole concept of the fiscal ebb and flow of the economy. I'm married to an accountant and it baffles me. Is that it's how it looks. Is that one
of your better decisions in life?
Well, I don't know. I'm 33 years old. He's kept a roof over my head.
I think marry a plumber if you can is good life advice.
Marry a plumber?
I would say.
Well, this conversation's taken on a turn.
Accountants are far less boring than you would think, Iain. We are absolute chandelier swingers.
Okay.
We're not.
Okay.
I was just trying to keep up the gags here. But I would just say very quickly, I would simply say, to come back to the question, when you see obviously the small boats crisis, you see, as Natasha said, the issues with the NHS waiting list, and then you top it all with Tory infighting. Even if there's a cohesive plan, the optics are so poor, it's very hard for ordinary members of the public to buy it.
See, I think, the answer to Martin's question, if you have to keep banging on that you have a plan, people then start to question whether you really do. Yeah. It's a bit like when politicians say, well, let me be clear.
Yes,
or so-and-so has been very clear about this. If they never haven't, otherwise they wouldn't have to keep saying it.
We need.
Now, let's have a follow-up call from Chris in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Iain. Panel. Is the Tories' best way of winning the general election to tack right and align with reform?
A lot of people seem to be suggesting that's what they're doing. Now, Reform did rather well in those two by-elections, 10% and 13%. The bigger they get, the more opportunity there is, Robert Goodwill, for disillusioned Conservative voters not to stay at home, but actually go out and vote for them, because they're effectively promoting themselves as the real Conservatives.
I think people understand that when they go and vote, if they vote for the Reform, or indeed if they vote for the Lib Dems in a straight Tory-Labour fight constituency, they're actually not using the vote effectively. So I think in a by-election, people see it as a free hit. And of course, there's no real evidence that people who are voting for Reform or UKIP or Brexit are all disillusioned Conservatives. Certainly in my constituency in the 2019 election, the big surprise was it was the people in the council estates, which was rock-solid Labour, that were crossing the road to shake my hand because they wanted Brexit delivered. Brexit seems to be a little bit off the agenda, but let's not forget that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party fought tooth and nail to try and stop Brexit happening, and I think people haven't forgotten that in the north where Caroline and I come from. I think also people understand that yes, we are in a difficult financial situation, but I didn't see Keir Starmer saying let's not help people with their fuel bills when Putin invaded Ukraine. He didn't say let's not have a furlough scheme to keep people's businesses afloat during the lockdown situation, or indeed voting against lockdown. So although Keir is, I think, benefiting from the difficult situation we're in, he doesn't give any evidence at all that he would have done anything different had he been elected Prime Minister, or indeed Mr Corbyn being elected Prime Minister in 2019.
Caroline, do you think Reform are a big danger to the Conservatives?
I think they're more trouble for the Conservatives than they are for Labour, and I think the 10%, 13% share of the vote in the two constituencies in the by-elections last week, speak to that. I mean, the problem is, and Chris says, should the Conservative Party tack to the right, or should they align with reform? I think it's really difficult in our system to get a system where they can align in a way that means that, some pact or something like that. It just doesn't work like that.
Well, it kind of did in the last election, didn't it? Because Nigel Farage, the predecessor of Reform was the Brexit Party. He stood down a lot of candidates in Labour-facing seats, so the Conservatives actually got an inflated majority.
Well, yeah, and that did happen then, but also I think
that happened in your seat.
Well, no, actually it didn't, and I think what happened was that there was such a big issue around Brexit. It was almost unnecessary, I would say. A mixture of Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn was, just a flank too far for us to win on. But I think in this election coming up, I think it goes to the point we made earlier. It's about the disunity that's happening, and already you've got people doing polls saying Boris should come back. Maybe that's for beyond the next general election, that he might rise again, I don't know. But it's this disunity, and Reform are there to jab them, poke the bear, I think, all the time, rather than do anything helpful for the Tories.
Any comments on Reform? Otherwise, I'll move on.
I mean, the populism that is creeping into the Conservative Party really terrifies me. Where you've got people who, they make no sense. Your Generics, your Badenochs, your Andersons, your Gullises, who are there pretty much on a far-right ticket, and I want to see a grown-up Tory party. I'm not a Tory, you know this about me, Ian, but if there were to be a Labour government, I would love there to be an opposition that I could see some of what they were saying was credible, and they were there to challenge in a grown-up way. And when we see this lurch to the right and this populism, that doesn't happen. So I really hope the Conservatives choose not to try and soak up that Reform vote.
I always slightly bristle when someone says far right in relation to those people. I kind of know where you're coming from, but that's a phrase that's traditionally been used for the racist right.
Yeah.
And I don't think
It's dangerous to
I
use
don't
it.
think you would class any of those people as sort of part of the racist right. Do we need to be a bit more careful about some of the descriptions that we use?
I think there's a lot of what they say that you could argue is a racist dog whistle and has an undercurrent that's appealing to racists.
I think the problem with that argument, which I appreciate why you're saying it, is that then we devalue the power of real far-right politics.
It also
and I think and that's the issue. And all I was going to say very quickly, just to add, because, in order to move on, is that I don't know whether I'm just living in la-la land, but I still firmly believe that a by-election vote, especially knowing there is the spectre of a general election before the end of the year, it's almost like a luxury vote, because you can sort of play around a bit, because you know that whatever you do and however it plays out, it's only going to have a shelf life of several months. And I still think there is an element of protest vote in the way people vote at by-elections, especially now.
Quickly?
Well, I think you just have to be careful about the phrases you use around these right-wing parties, because that was a mistake with the 2016 referendum. Too many people jumped onto a bandwagon to accuse people of voting Leave as being really right-wing. Lots of decent people voted to leave. Lots of Labour people who had very good social values voted to leave. So you've got to be really careful about this sort of language.
OK, we will move on to more discussions on swinging chandeliers in just a moment. It's 18 minutes past 8.
LB
see.
We have with us in the studio Natasha Devon, my LBC presenter colleague, Angela Epstein, journalist and broadcaster, Conservative MP Sir Robert Goodwill, and former Labour MP Caroline Flint. Now, a text question from Danny in Manchester. What can the West really do about the killing of Alexei Navalny? Is there any way Putin actually suffers consequences for this? Natasha.
It's so difficult, isn't it? Because there is a reason that Putin has surrounded himself by so much security and will only meet other leaders at a really long table in order to ensure that no one can get to him. And we covered this on my show on Saturday. We were talking about all of the protests that happened throughout Europe, with a lot of people of Russian descent saying the last hope for a different kind of Russia has died with Navalny, and asking for a real investigation and accountability. But the question then becomes, how will that ever be brought about? And I just don't know the answer.
Well, it won't be. That's the answer, isn't it? I mean, there's no way that the Russian state is going to facilitate that. Angela?
Well, it was what I found particularly chilling is the timing of it. I mean, if he was going to be taken out, as it were, why now when he was sort of almost, if you like, a spent force? I mean, obviously, he symbolised the opposition. He was the kind of shining example of what a liberal democracy should be like. He spoke out against Putin. But why take him out now? And the very fact that he did, especially before the upcoming election, which I suppose is just a done deal, really.
An election.
Exactly. With a very, very small e. It's almost to sort of quash future insurgents and say, look, even when we've dealt with you and you've been incarcerated and you're off the playing field, we can still get rid of you. It was almost like sort of firing the first bow, and I think that in itself was so symbolic. To do it now at this sort of late stage, when you would have thought the high impact would be as soon as he was incarcerated, says in itself that there is just so much sort of faith in that, as Natasha says, in that protection that Putin had. Because I don't know about you, but so many people said at the beginning, somebody's going to take Putin out. You know, when he invaded Ukraine, it was a bit James Bond-like. They have to take him out. There must be somebody close amongst the Praetorian Guard who are going to get rid of him. And they never did. And that's why we are where we are.
Caroline, I don't know if you saw the speech that Yulia Navalny made at the Munich Security Conference and the video that she's released today. I mean, she's someone to be reckoned with, isn't she?
Oh, yeah. And when I saw her speech at the Munich conference, and there was, just before she spoke, I think one of the journalists sort of said that, she had to choose at that point, having just found out her husband had died, between, getting up on that rostrum and making that speech, or going home to tell her two children that their father was dead and been killed. And she chose to step up. And I mean, look, her husband isn't the first, and he probably won't be the last symbol of opposition to be killed by Putin, his regime. We've already seen people just laying flowers, how they're yanked off the streets and everything else. And Yulia and others will step forward. But at the moment, to be honest, we can look at tightening up the sanctions. There is some issues that some US tech firms are still somehow getting technical equipment through to Russia that they can use as part of their defence. What's happening in Ukraine is in some ways a hope that actually they can be supported to basically beat Putin, and not Russia, beat Putin, because loss of face at this stage is probably the only thing we can do by him actually losing in that confrontation. I'm not saying that's easy for 1 second, but actually they are sort of, the last guard against him at the moment.
Robert?
Yeah, I think Alexei's wife showed tremendous courage. I mean, the frustrating thing is, we've got sanctions against Russia, but they still seem to be winning the ammunition battle with Ukraine. They're still managing to export energy to places like India and particularly China. I think we could do more at trying to prevent them exporting hydrocarbons, which give them income. I know when I was shipping minister, Soft.com, which is a big nationalised shipping industry, a lot of those ships have now been flagged out to various states. A lot of rust buckets around on the high seas, moving those oil tankers and gas. So I think we need to do more about that. I think we also need to bring pressure to bear on China, because it's China that is buying this energy. They're undercutting some of our Western manufacturers with this cheap energy. And we see President Xi, in Moscow calling Putin his friend. We buy a lot of stuff from China, and I don't think really it's acceptable that we should, sort of in by the back door be funding Putin through products we're buying from China. I think we need to make that very clear.
I'll be interested to see how the government's going to stop people buying stuff from China.
Well,
yeah,
that would be. You're right. That would be an interesting one.
I mean, the other problem is that in my house there's nothing. I think I've got one of those dolls, the wooden dolls that fits.
Matryoshka.
Exactly, from Russia. I have nothing else in my house from Russia at all, and that's the problem. How can we bring sanctions against a country where we don't really rely on them to buy anything apart from energy, which of course the Chinese and Indians are buying?
That's why I sort of disagreed respectfully with Caroline that Ukraine is sort of the last bastion of sort of representing opposition to Putin. To me, almost this elimination of Navalny is like saying, okay, onward Ukraine now, I can do this. I didn't need to do this. There was nothing to be gained by if he did assassinate him or order his killing, other than it being something symbolic. But it is that the symbolism was heavy in saying, I am invincible. And that's actually...
It was almost saying... I've done this because I can.
Exactly.
He doesn't care.
That's what I'm saying. And therefore, are you listening, Ukraine? I can do whatever I want to do.
That's why we mustn't let Ukraine fall.
No, not at all.
It's interesting you raised the China issue here, because it's so difficult to work out what the West, if we want to call it the West, can do about China. Because on the one hand, you see China trying to... improve its position in the international community, and then on the other it sort of does things which are equally as ruthless as Putin would do. And I mean, I wonder how many people listening to this programme know exactly what is in their house that is of Chinese origin. A couple of years ago when I bought a new laptop, I said to my computer guy, I said, I'd quite like to buy a laptop that wasn't Chinese, because I had Lenovo ones, and it was I can't remember what China was doing at that point. I thought, no, I'm going to take my business elsewhere, as you do. And he said, well, frankly, there is not a computer made in the world that doesn't have Chinese innards in it somewhere. Which is quite something to think about in a way.
I'm a grandfather now. We were looking for children's toys at Christmas, and virtually everything was Chinese. In the end, we actually bought Playmobil, which is made in Germany. But I went with a distinct...
I've got some vintage Playmobil.
Yeah, but
was it more expensive?
I said to my wife, we're not buying anything Chinese for our grandchildren. And it was very hard, but we managed it.
But was it more expensive?
It's good quality, put it that way.
Yeah, it is good quality, and that's the problem, you see. So it's market forces, because we can be morally opposed to the very concept of what China represents. But, you have these cheap websites that do fast fashion and all the other stuff, and self-interest is often king, and that's the problem.
Well, I was at Clumber Park, and I'm a member of the National Trust, and I popped into the National Trust shop after I'd had a nice coffee in the cafe as well. And I wanted to buy something, and I picked it up, and it was made in China.
Wow.
And I didn't buy it. And I just think, actually, it is difficult, this. But we could see, actually, some people sort of think about what they're purchasing for their outlets and things like this a little bit more.
Or have enough money to be able to buy sustainable, because I think poverty plays a role in things like fast fashion.
And I should say, because there will be, I know what's going to happen on the text now, because, they're being very racist against the Chinese. We're not against the Chinese people. It is the fact that they have a government that... I mean, you mentioned the Uyghur Muslims, for example, and see what they're doing to them. You see the dumping that they're doing with not just steel, but all sorts of other things in the economy. It is a deeply malevolent government.
And Hong Kong and all this rattling with Taiwan.
One thing about that relationship, though, Ian, in terms of China and Russia, and you're right to say there's been some alliances going on there, my sort of sense is, and this isn't take away anything of what you said about how China operates, but they tend to operate on the quiet. Putin is out there. He wants to wave his power, in 20 foot, 20 metre high notice boards. China does it more quietly, and I think they might feel that some of his activities and his brazenness and his public way he goes about these things might prove uncomfortable for them.
Well, that is true. I was watching a programme on PBS at the weekend called Putin and the Presidents, about his relationship with the different US presidents. And you got to the end of the programme and you thought, how could we not see that this is where it was going to end up? And there's been a huge failure of, I think, well, not particularly international diplomacy, but I think successive presidents, successive European leaders Angela Merkel being the worst offender here, have failed to understand Putin almost from the beginning. Anyway, end of sermon. It's 8:31. We'll move on in just a moment with our panel. Let's get the latest news headlines from Charlotte Morgan.
A Foreign Office minister has told MPs the UK holds Russia's government responsible for the death of Alexei Navalny. The Kremlin denies being involved. Avon and Somerset police say their investigation into the deaths of 3 children found at a house in Bristol is highly sensitive, complex and will take time. They were aged 7, 3 and 9 months. A woman's being held in custody in hospital on suspicion of murder. And the Business Secretary has told the Commons a former post office boss made completely false claims in a newspaper article and that she was right to sack him. Kemi Badenoch says there's no evidence Henry Staunton was told to stall compensation payments to sub-postmasters wrongly accused of theft. LBC weather, rain spreading over northern areas tonight, drier in the south, increasingly windy with a low of 6.
This is LBC.
.2529. We've just spent the last couple of minutes talking about all the different films that people have seen, because Caroline Flint is probably the biggest film buff that I know. What was it you did once? You spent a whole day watching films back to back in a cinema. I remember you telling me that.
I think my record was 6 in one day with my card. I don't know if I'm allowed to say which card it is, but I'm very military about it, in the sense I work out the timings so that I can avoid sitting through 25 minutes of ads and trailers.
So you flip from one screen to another?
I can, if I can get it right. But they're really making it harder these days to do that. And I have actually gone out in the car to do a radio interview in between getting back in again like that. But yeah, it was hard when I was an MP to get to the cinema. So, I go to Sheffield and it's, and it was a good way to see them all.
It must be easy for you to fly to Australia. Would be like a doddle.
Oh yeah, it'd be great.
12 films.
Yeah.
On
Don't you just fall asleep in them though? That's what I do.
Yeah, I do.
You've got to have an
You're not
eclectic,
the same age.
Yeah, but you've got to... You fall asleep, love. No, I think you've got to mix it up a bit. You need an eclectic mix, and for that 6, I had a mixture of some animation, comedies, a few horrors, and things like that, just to mix it up a bit to keep you awake.
Caroline and I from Yorkshire, we paid £12 to see a film. We make sure we watch it all. We don't fall asleep.
10 times.
It's
I've
even
got to
worse in
ask you:
Manchester.
are you hankering to get back into Parliament?
No.
You're not going to stand at the next election.
No.
Because last time we talked, you weren't quite sure.
No, I'm not going to be
Been
standing.
there,
Too many
done that.
films to
No,
watch.
I loved being the MP for Don Valley, and my constituency actually no longer exists. It's been carved into 3. And 22 years there, I was really passionate about it. And I'm just, no offence, but I'm just not one of those people who is a bit of a sort of, now I'll move on to somewhere else. I always thought being a constituency MP was
Robert, you're
a
standing
privilege.
down. Why did you make that decision?
Well, I've been in politics 25 years as well. I got elected to the European Parliament in '99. I'm 67 now. I mean, if I was a doctor...
I'm a youngster then.
If I was a doctor, would you say, why are you retiring at the age of 60? I'd been retired at age 60. I'd probably been on a 3-day week from 55 to 60. So, we've got a farm, we've got grandchildren, there is life outside.
And there are lots of graves to dig, aren't there? Because I gather you're a grave digger.
Yeah, I can do an advert for that. We have a green burial site. We've got about 600 people buried on the farm, and it's fantastic.
How much does it cost?
We plant. It's very reasonable.
Just in case I need on a need-to-know basis.
It's very reasonable. We've actually got a guy called Jimmy Boyce buried in our cemetery, who was MP for Rotherham. He's buried in my cemetery. His ashes. And I buried him on a particularly hot Sunday afternoon with his wife there, and I dug the hole for the ashes. And I was absolutely sweating buckets. And he said, I think Jimmy would have been proud that a Conservative was sweating to dig his grave.
Corey rightly says in my ear, I think it's moving on time. So let's go to a caller, because I could talk about that for the rest of the programme, I can assure you. Morris is in Salford. Hello, Morris.
Hi, good evening. My question is thank you. My question is if Sir Keir Starmer actually lost touch with reality.
And why do you ask that?
Yeah. So he's calling on Israel to make a ceasefire. If Hamas give back the hostages and put down their arms, on that second there's a ceasefire.
Well, of course, Keir Starmer told the Scottish Labour Party conference yesterday that he wants to see a ceasefire that lasts, adding the fighting must stop now. Natasha, I know you've been covering this a lot on your programme, just as I have. Has Keir Starmer lost connection with reality?
Well, I think the problem with asking Hamas to do anything is that Hamas are a death cult. They're a terrorist group. You famously can't negotiate with them, whereas, rightly, we hold the Israeli government to a higher standard because they're a democratically elected government. And, what I was saying on my show on Saturday is it's so difficult to see what the strategy is now, because at the beginning we were told the strategy was to get the hostages back and to destroy Hamas. Well, the leaders of Hamas are in Qatar. The people of the Gaza Strip are effectively being held hostage themselves, being used as so-called human shields, but their life seems to have no value whatsoever. And we have Netanyahu saying if the hostages aren't returned by Ramadan, that they're going to go into Rafah, the one place where Palestinian people, Gazan people, were told that they would be safe. And in bombarding that area, do they not run the risk of killing the remaining Israeli hostages? It's just the strategy doesn't seem to make any sense to me.
I suppose, to be fair, they haven't said they're going to bombard Rafah. They've said there would be a ground offensive, which is, I mean, I know it's sort of splitting hairs, but it is something a bit different. Robert?
Well, Natasha's absolutely right. I mean, and everybody in the country, apart from the BBC, recognise Hamas as a terrorist group. Israel, had that horrendous attack on the 7th of October. Hamas showed no mercy, and until the terrorists are eliminated, I don't think there's any prospect of peace. And it's all absolutely heartbreaking. But I think the point is, it doesn't really matter what the position of the British Labour Party is on this. It won't make any difference to what's going on there. And I think Keir Starmer was worried about another big rebellion. I think it was 50 or so of his members either abstained or voted against last time round. And I think basically had to cave in to pressure from his backbenchers. And of course, the story in the last couple of weeks, particularly from Rochdale, has been all about sort of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and it's reared its ugly head again, and it obviously hasn't gone away.
So when Boris says, has Keir Starmer lost connection with reality, are you saying that any slight change in the Labour's position, which I think there has been, but then again there's been a big change of position, I think, within the British government, what do you think's driven that?
I think pressure from his backbenchers, and the fact that the SNP in Scotland have been very clear that they're calling for a ceasefire. It's a unilateral ceasefire. This isn't a ceasefire when hostages are released. It isn't a ceasefire when we negotiate.
That's not true, Robert. Actually, there's the motion to the Scottish Labour Party conference did use the term ceasefire, but it also was based on the fact that there should be an immediate return of all the hostages and an end to the rocket launches that happened. So, I mean, I think part of the problem in some of this debate is ceasefire's become such a loaded term on one level. I mean, Keir Starmer said, we want to have a ceasefire that lasts. Of course we do, but for a ceasefire to last, there has to be something where both sides are willing to negotiate what would happen. And Natasha's absolutely right. It's really difficult to see through that at the moment because, Hamas, they want a ceasefire, but they want 130 days with 3 phases of releasing the hostages. They want all the troops out from Israeli troops out of Gaza. And on the other side, Netanyahu wants all the hostages returned, but also he wants to drive Hamas out. And some in Israel are wondering however you're going to achieve that. But I think clearly, since October the 7th, the level of destruction, you've only got to see the pictures, but also I think it's fair to say as well, some of the strategy of Netanyahu is not bringing the results that a lot of Israelis want.
Yeah, OK, so I was in Israel on October the 7th when it happened. I have family there, I have friends there. More significantly, I was in Israel on October the 6th, right? Very sunny day, cafes are full, everybody's going about their business. This came left of field. I was woken up by the sound of booming gunfire. I was staying in Jerusalem. This was an unprovoked attack by a genocidal terrorist organisation which has butchered, beheaded, burnt alive, kidnapped, raped and killed innocent people. And people in my family, my daughter-in-law lost somebody at the festival and also a young soldier. I have friends there whose young soldiers have been conscripted. Nobody wanted this war. It was an unprovoked attack. And Israel is not at war with the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza have a right to self-determination. Hamas was governing Gaza. They absolutely knew when they launched this attack there would be reprisals. And as far as Starmer is concerned, sorry, I was going to come to that, So as far as Starmer is concerned, first of all, I would say, from what I know from the people that I know in Israel, do you think they care less whether Starmer's dotting? And they have got, Hamas have said they will repeat...
He's likely to be British Prime Minister within a few months.
It doesn't matter. Hamas have said again and again and again that they will repeat October 7th. It is in their charter, not only to destroy Israel, but to wipe out world Jewry. This is not a territorial conflict.
I don't think any of us disagree with you on that.
So what I would say about Starmer is that he goes which way the wind blows. He's a weather vane politician. Remember, twice he would have supported Jeremy Corbyn had he been elected. At first, he adhered himself to the concept of Israel having a right to defend itself. Now, through political expediency, he has now moved because look what happened with Rochdale. Mark's right. At the beginning, he was so sluggish about acting. It was so manifestly wrong, as Ali said. No question about just acting immediately. He doesn't. He is a weather vane and he moves in order to shore up his own position.
Now, given you've mentioned his name, I have to say that the rest of the candidates in the Rochdale by-election, you can see them on lbc.co.uk/candidates. I wish they'd change that law. To say that so
did it to
often.
wind you up, Ian,
I know. Right. We're going to move on to something very different in a couple of minutes. Do stay tuned. It's 8:45.
This is LBC.
Caroline Flint, Robert Goodwill, Angela Epstein and Natasha Devon with us answering your questions, which the next one comes from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Good evening, all. My question is, the government seems at pains to suggest that it is not delaying payments to the postmasters following the Horizon scandal. Wouldn't the best way to prove they aren't delaying these payments be to actually just pay them?
Yes.
Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch has told MPs today that former Post Office Chair Henry Staunton's claims that he was told to stall paying compensation to victims of the Horizon scandal so the government could limp into the election are completely false, and that he was also accused of bullying while in that role. Mr Staunton has released a statement today insisting he stands by the comments he made to the Sunday Times and that he's not aware of any aspect of his conduct which could prompt bullying allegations. Well, Kemi Badenoch has said she's going to release the details of the conversation because minutes were taken. She's clearly not one to cross. Caroline?
I'm sort of thinking how it doesn't seem logical, although so many things have happened in the last 5 years. I'm probably wrong about this. But given where we are and given the huge lead in time to getting justice for the postmasters and mistresses, given there's a £1 billion pot of money that's already been identified, which Kemi re-announced today, confirmed today, I can't see what is the logic for the government really sort of planning to delay the payments before a general election, because you'd think you want to get them out as quickly as possible to make sure that that actually
and also
have something
a few hundred million
say.
Is not going to make an awful lot of difference to the public debt, is it?
No, not at all. So I just find it, I'm not sure about that. I think there are issues about slowness. I think there's issues around what the first offer is to people, and Mr Bates has obviously rejected that first offer.
And there are 3 schemes, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly. But I think, I can't see what the incentive is for delaying the payments unnecessarily.
Angela?
I just found it extraordinary, this war of words between a government minister
very entertaining, isn't it?
who essentially is saying, you are a liar, she's saying to the chairman of the Post Office. And I agree. I mean, look, we all have this visceral urge for justice. It's a shame that it took a television programme to bring it to its head and conclude the accountability there. But the fact is that people lost their lives, never mind their livelihoods. The money is there. And unless there is this is due process and there's some kind of legally intricate reason why things have to sort of, in my corner of the world, we say schlep through the courts or whatever, I don't understand. What to me, it's fascinating that there is an accusation that this is a deliberate move to, after everything we know, that there should be a deliberate move to keep the money from these people is extraordinary.
Schleppen, German for drag, which I suppose is a Hebrew, because I speak German.
Do you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Lots of things about me you don't know.
Well,
Natasha.
I have my standards and refuse to raise them.
I agree with what's been said. Staunton versus Badenoch, it's got an element of Alien versus Predator, hasn't it? It's like, whose side am I supposed to be on here? But it doesn't seem to me to make any sense to delay the payments for fiscal reasons, particularly when that TV programme was so powerful in bringing about a change, a shift in public mood and a sense of urgency. There is an easy win here for the Conservative Party in ensuring that financial justice is done.
It's very interesting, Robert. This morning, Number 10 were briefing that Kevin Hollinrake, the Post Office Minister, was going to make this statement today, and Kemi Badenoch said, oh no, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
What do you read into that?
Well, she was up. I saw it at the dispatch box today, on the TV, and I was pretty convinced she was absolutely right what she said. I mean, it's interesting that the accusation was that are we going to try and slow down the payments. The fact is that the tranche of payments that Mr Staunton was in charge of have all been paid. 100% of those have been paid, and I think there's a perception out there that the government didn't do anything until it was on the ITV programme. I mean, we've had lots of statements in Parliament. We had the First Sight investigation.
I don't think we should open this box, Rob.
And now we brought forward legislation to exonerate them all and to make sure the money's paid as quickly as possible. Obviously, the first tranche of people that went to court, most of their conversation went to the lawyers. And I think now it's about opening that one up. There's people who were convicted who weren't part of that tranche who are now going to get sort of around about 600,000 starting money. I've got 2 constituents affected, and it's been deeply affecting to them. And also, I mean, what I can't really get my head around is why did at some point did somebody in the Post think, why are we hiring all these dishonest people.
And what I don't understand is if Kemi Badenoch has sacked the chairman, why is the chief financial controller still in position? Because he started in 2015 and would have been probably the instigator of a lot of the things that have gone wrong. But here's a quiz question for you all. Who was the first MP to ask a question in the House of Commons on the Horizon
Was
scandal?
it James Arbuthnot?
Incorrect.
Ah.
Somebody you know well?
Wasn't Kevin Jones?
No, it was Jackie Smith.
Wow.
There you go. As she keeps reminding me on that for the many podcast. Right, next question. Robbie, thank you very much for that. Next question is from Sandra in Felixstowe. Will Esther Ranson's campaigning on assisted dying convince Parliament it needs to be legalised now? Now, Dame Esther has told LBC she has signed up to the Swiss assisted dying clinic Dignitas and has written a letter calling for MPs to have a free vote on legalised assisted dying in the UK. Now, you can hear more of her exclusive interview with Nick Friary at breakfast tomorrow morning from 7. Caroline.
Yeah, I think there should be a free vote, and I think it's a really difficult situation. It's a view I had when I was an MP, and lots of people wrote to me on both sides of the argument very passionately, and I know there are lots of issues around worries and concerns about this, but I sort of find it something very wrong about only those people who can afford to can go abroad for this option, this final option. So I really do think we should. It's like other issues in which we have a free vote. We should have that in Parliament.
Angela.
I don't know. I mean, the idea of somebody living in a life suspended in absolute pain and agony, and there is only one direction of travel, and every day they become more and more compromised, is so, God forbid, so terrifying for anybody to ever experience. And yet, there's something in me that's screaming the sanctity of human life, where there's hope. And that's a very privileged position to take when, thank God, it's not you that's in that position. I think Caroline's right. There definitely needs to be a free vote on this. And I hadn't actually thought about it before as a kind of an economic issue as much as anything else. Why people who are well off have a right to die when people who are not don't. But I think setting that aside, which is really important, there is just still something in me that finds it very hard to reconcile. I'm just so glad I don't have to be part of that process in Parliament or elsewhere to make those kind of decisions or to vote on such a thing. I'm sorry if that's a cop-out, but it's just too intractable and nuanced for me to be able to sort of come down on.
Robert Goodwill.
I'm cautious about the whole thing. I mean, just over a year ago, I had a very close friend who died of lung cancer, and the palliative care he got was absolutely superb. My wife takes a different view. She thinks, if you had a dog that was sick, you'd put it down. But then there's finance. We're talking about finance, but there's financial pressures. Grandma's not very well, and it's costing us £1,000 a week in the care home. Maybe, and I worry a little bit that those sort of pressures might come to bear. The doctors are very good at pain relief, and in most cases, certainly in the case of my friend, he slipped away without. He was in pain, but it wasn't unbearable. And other conditions are more debilitating and more painful. But I think I'm still very cautious about the whole thing.
Natasha.
You'd have to be so careful, particularly about the element of coercion. And something that hadn't occurred to me, I listened to a feminist podcast called Standard Issue, and they were talking about the fact that no one really seems to care when women die at home as it is at the hands of their partners. And to give abusive partners another tool in their arsenal to coerce is potentially a very dangerous thing. That's not to say that I'm not in favour of giving people the right to die. I just think it has to be handled so carefully.
Well, it would have to be, but there is the right to die in various other countries, in various states in America, and I've seen very little evidence so far that there's been a huge number of, shall we say, dubious deaths through these means. I take probably a much more extreme view than anybody on this panel on this, in that I think if I want to die, even if I haven't got some life-threatening illness, that is my decision. And I don't see why we're going to be talking about diabetes in the next hour. If my diabetes got out of control in, say, 10 years' time, and I was facing having my legs and arms amputated or something like that, I might decide myself that my quality of life would not be good enough to continue. And I wouldn't want to sort of take my own life, but I would possibly want the ability to do it legally. On that happy note, let's move
You're fun
on
at parties,
to fine, exactly. That's why I don't get invited to any. Let's go to our final question from Gemma in York. If your phone was taken away from you for the day, which app would you really struggle to do without? And obviously, you're all going to say the LBC app, but let's take that out of the equation. I thought I'd save you there, Natasha.
Thank you, Ian. It would be Audible, because I used to have this waist-height pile of non-fiction, all by brilliant writers saying important stuff, but my head gets turned by sexy fiction books. So when I read a physical book, it's always fiction, and I thought I've got to find a way to get these non-fiction books into my brain. So I'm always, when you see me walking around, I'm listening to an audiobook, normally.
Well, I could be a real stir and say the BBC app, but I won't.
But that would mean that you'd never be invited onto the programme again,
exactly,
Angela.
which is why I didn't say it.
Well, you did, actually.
I didn't. I was just playing
Corey
to the crowd.
stole that one away.
Corey, for these prices, he'll have me back. No, the one that I couldn't do without is WhatsApp. I can't do without WhatsApp. As much as it annoys me and as much as it pings, especially when you're on the phone and that green message flies past, there's just that sense that there's stuff going on.
You can turn alerts off. It's quite clever.
But I
They're designed to induce a Pavlovian response. Your phone's telling you when to check it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I am absolutely the dog in the game here because I just can't do without it. I mean, there is that kind of the famous one when my kids were first texting. My eldest is now 30, and I think text was just coming in when he just got a phone going to high school, and in the middle of the day I got a text saying, "Mum, can you buy bananas and stink bombs on the way home?" And I just realised then that connectivity was never going to be the same again.
It's the cornerstones of any balanced diet, isn't it? Bananas and stink bombs.
Yes.
Caroline.
It's the new Atkins.
Yeah, WhatsApp is something, I think partly because with my kids, it's not just a message, I can see them. It's that one, it's easier than going on Zoom or anything else. You can instantly see the person. And I think that's come out of the pandemic and everything, hasn't it, really? It's just changed the way we can communicate. But I think the other ones for me is actually, I never was really much of an online shopper for anything, really. I like to go into stores and touch stuff and try it on and things like this. My husband says, you can't go in a shop without touching everything. But now I've become really good at booking trains. I mean, I couldn't do without that app. And even banking, actually, I mean, that's made, my life so much easier. I can't remember the last time I went
into a bank.
Yeah.
You can't find any, that's
can't find any, yeah, that's true as well.
Apple Pay as well.
But yeah, those ones, invention. I think. Yeah.
Robert?
It's only recently become an issue for me because we've only had a mobile signal at home for about 4 years. And
the northern wastelands.
Can't you get a mask put in at the same time?
Google is the thing I use because I'm lazy. I don't remember facts. I know I can always Google them. Yeah. My wife always leaves her phone at home, so it's not a problem for her. And my middle son, Harry, he'll turn his phone off for hours on end listening to Wagner, can you believe? So I think maybe, if I turn my phone off, I should listen to
Major trigger alert.
Right, thank you all very much for joining us today. Caroline Flint, Sir Robert Goodwill, Angela Epstein and Natasha Devon. On tomorrow's panel, the Lib Dem London mayoral candidate, can you name him, Rob Blackie, the Sunday Telegraph columnist Zoe Strimple, plus a couple of MPs, Kirsty Blackman from the SNP and Chris Clarkson from the Conservatives. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to be talking about diabetes because about 1 million adults in England have type 2 diabetes but do not yet know it. Could you be one of them? We'll find out in the next hour because we're going to be joined by Dr. Ellie Cannon, who's an expert on diabetes. I've become a bit of an expert on it myself because I suffer from it as well. So this data from the ONS also suggests that maybe 5 million people are on the cusp of developing diabetes. Well, how do you know if you've got it? It's actually quite easy to self-diagnose. And I suspect after the next hour, there'll be probably quite a few hundred, if not thousands of you heading down to your GP over the course of the next couple of weeks asking, have I got diabetes? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the widow of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny claims he died after being poisoned by Vladimir Putin and that his body is being withheld as part of a cover-up. The Kremlin denies involvement, saying he'd fallen ill in prison after taking